Freud famously speaks about primary and secondary narcissism. This is an important distinction that he makes actually maybe a decade or so after he starts utilizing the term narcissism in his work. But the question then arises, how does Lacan take up this distinction between primary and secondary narcissism? And as of Lacan Seminar 1, we'd have to say that he's not simply going to inherit some of Freud's distinctions, but is going to offer a slightly different way of thinking about it, and certainly going to do so in a way that makes reference to the notions of the three registers, particularly the distinction between the imaginary and the symbolic. But if we're going to try and get our heads around this somewhat challenging question, we're going to look a little bit at Laplanche and Pontalis' The Language of Psychoanalysis, and they will help us plot a kind of itinerary for how Freud introduces the concept and what he means. So our starting date is 1910, say Laplanche and Pontalis, and they say this is the first time that the concept of narcissism appears in Freud's work. And when he first uses it, it is so as to it's called upon to account for the object choice in the life of homosexual subjects who take themselves as their sexual object. So we could say then that the first time that the notion of narcissism appears in Freud, it's very much linked to the question of object choice. Whom do I love? Whom do I take as my sexual object? So let's go back to Laplanche and Pontalis, 255. That is to say, the homosexual who takes their own self as their object choice proceeds from a narcissistic basis and looks for a young man, we're talking about men obviously, a young man who resembles themselves and whom they may love as their mother had loved them. So there's a resembles themselves dimension. So we could say then that this is the first mention of narcissism, and it's about a loved object. You could say it's narcissism used as a way of understanding object choice. Right, 1910. Now we move on to the Schreber case, 1911. And Laplanche and Pontalis say the discovery of narcissism leads Freud to posit the existence of a stage in sexual development and a stage between autoeroticism and object love. Now, we see Freud mention this a number of different times, but let's just reiterate then, we've had a 1910 use of narcissism to think about object choice. Now we have a second use of the term to think about it as a stage in development, precisely between autoeroticism, where the body of the infant is itself an erotic object as such. We can think about the famous example of sucking one's thumb. One can have some autoerotic satisfaction within the remit of one's own body. But then, of course, we have this question of how do we get to loving things outside of us, to objects outside of us. And presumably one way that we would move from the bodily satisfactions that we can take from our own body to an external object is logically to take oneself as an object, as a minimally externalized object, which then opens up a world of external objects. So the crucial point here is that now we're thinking about narcissism as a stage. Right, that's a second point. By 1914, we have a new idea. We're thinking about narcissism and libidinal investments, and we come up with what we could call, and what Laplanche and Pontalis nicely call, a kind of seesaw theory. So here we have an idea of libidinal investments, and we're talking about libidinal investments, or as they put it, libidinal cathexes. And to cite Laplanche and Pontalis, it becomes clear that the possibility of the libidos investing in the ego also involves withdrawing cathexes from objects in the outside world. So, in other words, why the seesaw analogy works well is because now Freud is talking about ego libido and object libido. In other words, libidinal investments in the ego itself and libidinal investments in the outside world. The more one is focused on, the more the other is depleted, right? So in the seesaw, the more there is an investment in the ego, the more there is, the less there is an investment in the outside world. And the more there is an investment in the outside world, the less there is in the ego. They put it in these terms. Freud postulates a seesaw balance between ego libido, that is, libido, which cathects the ego, and object libido. The more of the one is employed, the more the other becomes depleted. They cite Freud. The ego is to be regarded as a great reservoir of libido from which libido is sent out to objects and which is always ready to absorb libido flowing back from objects. So we've got this kind of movement in and out. Okay, so now this is what I'm calling the seesaw theory. What now becomes rather interesting is from this seesaw theory of libido, we have an intervention by Carl Abraham. And now the timing's a little bit out actually, because Carl Abraham is already starting to talk about these ideas, but this is an idea that he puts forward that Freud approves. The process of withdrawing an investment from an object and turning it back into the subject is something that had been identified by Carl Abraham. He gives this nice description. He says the psychosexual characteristic of dementia praecox, we could say schizophrenia, is the return of the patient to autoeroticism. The mental patient transfers onto himself alone as his only sexual object the whole of the libido, which the healthy person turns upon living and inanimate objects in the environment. So that's the end of the quote. And that comes from Carl Abraham's The Psychosexual Differences Between Hysteria and Dementia Praecox. Laplanche and Pontalis remark that Freud adopts these ideas of Abraham's, and they quote him, which have been accepted in psychoanalysis and have become the basis of our attitude to the psychoses. So now we're starting to get a sense of a secondary form of narcissism, which is the result of a whole lot of investments, libidinal investments in the world coming back in, a retreat, a pulling back in of libidinal investments in the world. And this is also then given a kind of pathological hue, certainly so from Carl Abraham. Remember, he says, the whole of the libido which the healthy person turns upon all living and inanimate objects. So this idea now, we've had an object choice use of the notion of narcissism. We've had a stage, a developmental infantile narcissism understanding. Then we've had the seesaw theory. And now you could say the seesaw theory is also being used as a way of thinking about a type of psychopathology or a type of, psychotic orientation to the world. Freud endorses this idea from Abraham, but he adds the idea, back to Laplanche and Pontalis, which facilitates a clear distinction between narcissism and autoeroticism, that the ego does not exist from the very first as a unity, and that a new psychical action has to take place in order to bring about narcissism. So that's the famous line, a new psychical action has to take place between autoeroticism and what follows if we're going to think about how narcissism develops. And what I think that the crucial point there is that there's a new psychical action that has to take place between autoeroticism and object choice in the outside world, which of course would also entail narcissistic object choice in the outside world. Right, so one slight problem that starts to emerge here, and you see Freud already anticipating it. The way Abraham uses these terms, you could say that sometimes autoeroticism and a kind of supposed primary narcissism seem to be a little bit smudged. They're not always fundamentally clear. But now, interestingly enough, Laplanche and Pontalis offer one further point, but then they introduce Lacan, which is kind of unusual because, you know, this is fundamentally a book about Freudian psychoanalysis, but they say that he adds something important. So let's see what they say. Just two lines before we move on to Lacan. They say, if we are to preserve a distinction between a state on the one hand, in which the sexual instincts attain satisfaction anarchically, independently of one another, and narcissism on the other hand, where it is the ego in its entirety which is taken as a love object, then we must inevitably make the period of infantile narcissism dominance coincide with the formative moments of the ego. In other words, they're still worried a little bit about how to manage this idea between autoeroticism and how we're going to think about the kind of primary narcissism. And one of the questions which seems to trouble Freud and which remains is this: is primary narcissism a kind of inherent state, or is it something which is developed? And there seems to be some vacillations in psychoanalytic theory as to whether this is the case. And in fact, this is what they say. On this point, psychoanalytic theory is somewhat ambivalent. From the genetic point of view, i.e. the developmental point of view, the establishment of the ego can be conceived of as the formation of a psychical unit paralleling the constitution of the bodily schema. So do we want to think about the ego as inherently, just to reiterate the thing, as inherently having a kind of narcissistic quality, or do we want to think about it as a function of development? They argue one may suppose that this unification is precipitated by the subject's acquisition of an image of themselves founded on the model furnished by the other person, this image being the ego itself. So if there is to be a kind of bringing together of the bodily image of the subject, then there's going to be a bodily unification, let's say, of the subject's sense of itself. This seems to require an image. If we're going this route, say Laplanche and Pontalis, narcissism then appears as the amorous captivation of the subject by this image. Jacques Lacan has related this first moment in the ego's formation to that fundamentally narcissistic experience which he calls the mirror stage. So here they're saying that this is a significant development by Lacan, and they're also saying that it answers some questions. But here comes the pivotal quote, which I think is very crucial. They're talking about Lacan's mirror stage, and then they say, in this light, with the ego taking form by virtue of an identification with the other, narcissism, and even primary narcissism, is no longer seen as a state independent of any intersubjective relationship, but is rather an internalization of a relationship. So it might be worthwhile just reiterating that, because what they're saying is two things. What Lacan offers is something of value, because the question of narcissism and how it arises and in its relationship to the body's autoerotic potentialities is a complicated one. So they're saying it's valuable, but they're also suggesting that if you take Lacan's theory of narcissistic development within the mirror stage seriously, then it poses questions of how we might think about the very notion of a primary or quasi-inherent form of narcissism. So here's the quote again. In this light, they're talking about Lacan's mirror stage, with the ego taking form by virtue of an identification with the other, okay? Ego taking form by virtue of an identification with the other. Narcissism, and even primary narcissism, which they put in scare quotes, is no longer seen as a state dependent of any intersubjective relationship, but is rather the internalization of a relationship. So what that means then is that however we want to talk about primary narcissism, if we're doing this from a Lacanian frame, is that narcissism does not predate a rudimentary, elementary intersubjective relationship, or to make that even clearer, it doesn't predate the subject's relationship with an image. They go on to say that this idea that they've just suggested about the subject's relationship to an image is consistent with what Freud proposes in Mourning and Melancholia in 1917. They say it's consistent, and in Mourning and Melancholia, Freud certainly appears to see nothing more in it than a narcissistic identification with the object. This is how he's using identification. Okay, so we seem to have a little bit of clarity, but then things get a little bit more complicated, because they say now we have a development in Freud's theory when we have the second theory of the psychical apparatus. Okay, so as is well known to begin with, at the time of interpretation of dreams, Freud is thinking about a rudimentary distinction between an unconscious, a preconscious, and a conscious. But now we have ego, id, and superego. And this we're now thinking about, let's see, 1921, 1923, particularly by the time of 1923, the ego and the id, we've got a slightly different conceptualization of the psychical apparatus. By this time, say Laplanche and Pontalis, Freud has come to maintain an absolute opposition between a first objectless narcissistic state and object relations, libidinal object relations. They continue. This primitive state, now called primary narcissism, is supposed to be characterized by a total absence of any relationship to the outside world and by a lack of differentiation between ego and id. Interuterine existence is taken to be its prototypical form, while sleep is deemed a more or less successful imitation of that ideal model. So with this turn in Freud's theorizing, we have a way of understanding primary narcissism, which is pre-social, essentially. And we would have to say that Lacan would have some issues with that, right? For him, the mirror stage is the moment when, or the process where narcissistic identifications start to occur. But interestingly, and it's worthwhile stressing the difference here, around this time, 1921, 23, Freud has come to maintain an absolute opposition between a first objectless narcissistic state. An objectless narcissistic state. I wonder if in Lacanian terms that even makes sense, because a narcissistic relation in Lacanian theory involves an engagement with an image. That is a necessity. You need to have some image to give the ego a sense of substantiality. So without an image, without a rudimentary externality, without a rudimentary social dimension, imaginary dimension, if we want to call it that, you don't really have narcissism. But Freud is now positing an absolute opposition between a first objectless narcissistic state. To reiterate, this primitive state called primary narcissism is supposed to be characterized by the total absence of any relationship to the outside world and by a lack of differentiation between ego and id. So what's kind of interesting about that, it's almost as if we could say we could use this idea of primary narcissism in a hypothetical way. There's an interesting line in the Seminar 1 when Lacan says something like, well, that is prior to what we can theorize psychoanalytically. In other words, his idea is that you need to always take into account this engagement with an image, with another. And this primitive, what I'm trying to say is that the way primary narcissism is being utilized here is almost as a kind of hypothesis, as a postulate. And it's interesting to say that those two moments that he's thinking about as exemplary, this idea that intrauterine existence is the prototypical form of primary narcissism. I mean, you know, from a Lacanian standpoint, you could maybe ask, well, is that even pre-social? Because there's some kind of engagement, or certainly there's some kind of experience of a mother's voice and sensations and so on and so forth. But let's not go there. But also that there is this idea that when one is asleep, one has, in a sense, returned to kind of primary narcissism. So primary narcissism, in that terminology, it's almost as if we're talking about a retreat from the world, where one is existing in a, I want to say, monadic, almost solipsistic state. Those words aren't quite adequate, but when one has really not engaged in the dialectic of engagement with externality. So Laplanche and Pontalis continue, and this next paragraph is quite useful. They say the idea of a narcissism contemporaneous with the formation of the ego through identification with the other person nonetheless does still find some existence in this theory of what Freud is saying. Now, let's just note that what they're saying there, the idea of a narcissism contemporaneous with the formation of the ego through identification with others does survive. So what they've just said, narcissism in terms of a relationship with others, in terms of identifications that are part of the ego's formation, that's the kind of narcissism, in a way, the only narcissism that Lacan is engaging with. He's not going to do this positing of a kind of primary narcissistic state prior to this. I suppose the way I would try and maybe rescue or maintain the Freudian concept of come 1923 of this posited hypothetical primary narcissism is see it as in a kind of diacritical relation to what is seen as the secondary narcissism. So it's kind of posited. There must be something that comes before this secondary narcissism that he's going to go on to describe. But from a Lacanian standpoint, we would wonder, can you even call that narcissism? All right. Back to Laplanche and Pontalis, they cite Freud to back up this idea that there is a kind of secondary kind of narcissism. The libido, which flows into the ego, owing to identifications with the outside world, brings about its secondary narcissism. Another quote from Freud, the narcissism of the ego is thus a secondary one which has been withdrawn from objects. The narcissism of the ego is thus a secondary one which has been withdrawn from objects. Okay, so they then go on to note this profound modification of Freud's views is correlated to two things. In the first place, by the introduction of the notion of the id as a separate agency from which other agencies derive through a process of differentiation. And secondly, with the evolution of the concept of the ego, which places the emphasis as much on its adaptive role as differentiated agency is on the identifications of which it is as a product. In other words, what becomes maybe the more salient difference here, if we want thinking about some of the challenges and the conceptual difficulties ahead, is that for Freud, you could say there needs to be something, a way of understanding narcissistic identifications and narcissistic relations, which henceforth can be seen as a kind of secondary form of narcissism. He wants to keep that, but he also wants to keep the notion that the ego is a kind of inherent potentiality. And so we have this posited primary state of narcissism, and then we have narcissistic secondary relationships, which are much more about the social world. Now, interestingly, Laplanche and Pontalis say, if we're going to go this route, we incur at least two risks. First, there is the danger of running counter to experience by asserting that the newborn baby is without any perceptual outlet for the external world. In other words, if you posit a primary narcissism, that sounds like there's a primary, it limits how we think about the prodigious investments, libidinal investments that the child might make in the world, if they have a narcissistic dimension to their ego. And of course, the whole point for Lacan is that the ego develops, that it's not already there. They also say, the second of the two risks that they posit, we may find ourselves reopening the door to a version of the idealist fallacy made all the more flagrant by being expressed in biological language. Just how are we supposed to picture the transition from a monad shut in upon itself to a progressive discovery of the object? So they're saying that if there is a kind of primary narcissism of that sort, might it also pose further explanatory challenges for how we think about what they call a progressive discovery of the object if the monad is shut in upon itself. So it's interesting. I mean, these are two very faithful readers of Freud and of psychoanalysis, but they're suggesting that there's inconsistencies and some difficulties in Freud's handling of the topic. Now, of course, you know, we may still want to utilize these terms in kind of inverted commas to suggest that maybe, you know, they're fundamentally finalized and that they're kind of hypothetical in some ways. But you can see that there's inconsistencies already within Freud, particularly what I've just said in terms of primary narcissism and secondary narcissism, as we're thinking it in papers like Ego and Id in 1923, and how Ferenczi has used it as early as 1908, where he's thinking of secondary narcissism as the retreat, the withdrawal of narcissistic investments in the world back into the ego. Remember when we were talking about the more psychopathological utilization, not psychopathological utilization, but the utilization of these ideas to make a point in terms of psychopathology. Okay, so how does Lacan respond to some of these issues? Well, not very clearly, it must be said, although actually we could challenge that. In fact, maybe there is some clarity to how he approaches the issues in Seminar 1. So in a chapter called The Two Narcissisms of Seminar 1, Lacan brings up this topic. And let's just put it as simply as possible. The way he's going to differentiate these two narcissisms has everything to do with the mirror stage. But we should also note that, you know, the more I look for it, the distinction between primary and secondary narcissism he doesn't, because we've seen that this inherent notion of an inherent primary narcissism is not one that really works for Lacan, that the whole conceptual distinction between a primary and secondary narcissism doesn't really find its grounding in Lacanian theory. And although Lacan will speak about it in Seminar 1, he starts to formulate it in somewhat different terms. So just to give you a sense of where we're going with that, one of the ways that he will go on to speak about it will involve the distinction between ideal ego and ego ideal. Ideal ego is a kind of lovable, narcissistically affirming image that one falls in love with and that one maintains and holds dear, and that shows one in the most lovable possible light, and that you can be in love with that image. And then we have the ego ideal, which is something more like the symbolic coordinates that give us the criteria for what is lovable in this social situation. So clearly the first one is more sort of narcissistically imaginary, the ideal image of myself that I love and that I cherish. And the second one is much more grounded in the symbolic coordinates of what a mother or a father or a parental figure or authority thinks is lovable about me. But let's go directly to Lacan. So this is on page 125 of Seminar 1, and he says, a little while ago, Mononi mentioned the two narcissisms. First of all, there is in fact a narcissism connected with the corporeal image. So this is how he's going to refer to Freud's ideas, but he's going to give a different conceptual articulation, and he's going to do so in reference to imaginary and symbolic ideas. So first of all, there is a narcissism connected with the corporeal image. This image gives the subject their Umwelt and gives the form to their Umwelt. In other words, this image plays an important role of integrating their sense of their own body, their sense of their own subjectivity, and locating them in a situation, in an environment. So this is how he's kind of talking about a type of narcissism. This type of narcissism makes up the unity of the subject, and we see the subject projecting it in 1,000 different ways. It includes the Selbstgefühl, sorry, can't speak German, the self-feeling which the human being has of their own body. So just to reiterate, this first type of narcissism, he's being careful, I think, here to avoid the term primary narcissism, but this is, I think, what he's trying to create this a kind of distinction that parallels something of what Freud is saying. This is a narcissism that involves an image, and the role of an image in unifying, in create a bodily image, I should be clear, that creates a sense of substantiality and wholeness and cohesion of the subject's various bodily experiences, and it locates them within an environment. And you could say that that's a kind of structural necessity of any image. Well, as long as it's an image that is not merely a cutout image singly of the body, because an image of me will always locate me in place. As you can see, I've got loads of books and CDs around me. My image is located in a place. Okay. This initial narcissism is to be found, if you wish, at the level of an image in my schema. And of course, he's referring to his optical schema, which we won't discuss here. But I'm just trying to reiterate the point that it makes possible the organization of the totality of reality in a framework of sorts. This is me citing Lacan. Okay. To be sure, this way of functioning is completely different in man and in animals, which are adapted to a uniform Umwelt. For the animal, there's a limited number of pre-established correspondences between its imaginary structure and whatever interests it in its Umwelt. So in other words, you say, well, both human beings and animals need this to be located in their environment, but there's a kind of sense in which animals have a more limited, almost a kind of pre-prepared, pre-formed frameworks that locate them in an environment. Humans seem to be a little bit less tethered to an environment, and you could say, therefore, need an image even more. I'm thinking, I don't know if this is what Lacan is thinking in the back of his mind here, but I'm thinking a little bit of Heidegger and the idea of thrownness. We're thrown into an environment. And this is something that's distinctive of Dasein, or human experience. Continuing with Lacan. In human beings, the reflection in the mirror indicates an original possibility and introduces a second narcissism. So he says a second narcissism here. Its fundamental pattern is immediately the relation to the other. For human beings, the other has a captivating value on account of the anticipation that is represented by the unitary image as it is perceived either in the mirror or in the entire reality of the fellow being. So now there's a slightly different aspect. Of course, you could say that they overlap, but he's conceptually creating a distinction. Not only then do we have the function of an image in holding us in place, in integrating the corporeality of our experience, a bodily image that locates us in an environment, but that also now is paving of the way, sets in place the possibility for an intersubjective relation with others. Let's just go back to that quote. We're talking here about what introduces a second narcissism. Its fundamental pattern is immediately the relationship to the other. Now, you could say, well, the image I see in the mirror is already an other, and I think that's true. But I think in the context he's talking about here, he is creating a distinction and saying even my mirror image is the first step, in a sense, to how I engage with others outside. Let's see, continuing now, still on page 125 of Seminar 1. For human beings, the other has a captivating value on account of the anticipation that is represented by the unitary image as it's perceived either in the mirror or in the entire reality of the fellow being. The other, the alter ego, is more or less confused with the ich ideal, this ego ideal invoked throughout Freud's article. Narcissistic identification. The word identification without differentiation is unusable, he says. Narcissistic identification, that of the second narcissism, is identification with the other, which under normal circumstances enables man to locate precisely his imaginary and libidinal relationship to the world in general. That is what enables him to see in its place and to structure, as a function of this place and of his world, his being. So it's not just then that we are located in the world, but we are given more precision and focus and grounding in this relationship to the other. And just to reiterate, the relationship to my mirror image and the relationship to the individual person in the outside world certainly can overlap, but there seems to be something important about this intersubjective quality. He goes on to say, and we start to see that, because he says it is with reference to this relationship to the other that we start to see the ich ideal, this ego ideal. And basically, my sense of what Lacan is doing is, where Freud wants to talk about primary and secondary narcissism, Lacan is much more interested in talking about ideal ego and imaginary ideal ego and ego ideal. The first being a more imaginary relationship that's enabled via an image itself, and the other being a dimension in how the other person locates me in a symbolic world. Moving on to page 126, Lacan says, hence you can see that one has to distinguish between the functions of the ego on the one hand, which I'm relating to the role of the image, and the fundamental role in the structuration of reality that they play, and that there's a fundamental alienation constituted by the reflected image of himself, as well as that of the relationship to the other. Now, it's not a very clearly constructed sentence, but you can see what I'm getting at again, that now the notion of an other, in as much as that other brings to the fore the ich ideal, the ego ideal, starts to become a significant and important way to think about this difference between, you could say, two levels or two types of narcissistic formation. He says, I've already given you the initial element of this schema. Today, I'm focusing on another, the reflexive relationship to the other. Okay, so we see that coming through, I think, reasonably clearly in that passage. Let's close then just briefly with a quick note from Jonathan Scott Lee's book, simply entitled Jacques Lacan. And he's going to say the following about narcissism. He's actually focusing on Lacan's paper on aggressivity, and notes how Lacan there speaks a little bit about on narcissism. And Leah then says, well, Leah Lee says, this is an important paper. Freud himself virtually defines the ego as essentially narcissistic and deepens the perhaps crude notion of self-love by taking narcissism to involve the relationship between the ego and an image of its ideal. He writes, and so here is a quote from Freud on taken from on narcissism. The development of the ego consists in a departure from primary narcissism and gives rise to a vigorous attempt to recover that state. The departure is brought about by means of the displacement of libido onto an ego ideal imposed from without, and satisfaction is brought about from fulfilling this ideal. So this is kind of an important quote because it helps you get a sense of where Lacan is coming from. I'll give it to you one more time. The development of the ego consists in a departure from primary narcissism and gives rise to a vigorous attempt to recover that state. So the postulation here is that there was a kind of primary type of self-love, a primary type of self-love which the infant will go on to try and recover from an external state. That's kind of clarifying, I think, even though Lee wants to suggest that maybe there's something about this notion of self-love which is a bit crude. But this idea of an early existent self-love sounds a little bit, well, is what Freud talks about in terms of primary narcissism. This departure is brought about by means of the displacement of libido onto an ego ideal imposed from without. And satisfaction is brought about from fulfilling this ideal. So here we find in Freud, I mean, this is a nice passage because it both links us to what Freud is saying, obviously, and a Freudian conceptualization of primary narcissism as a type of self-love. Here, the qualification is helpful, and how that type of self-love now is linked to something from the outside world. And the phrase, for a third time, sorry for the repetition, a displacement of libido onto an ego ideal imposed from without. So from a Lacanian standpoint, that distinction between an existing state of self-love and a displacement of that libidinal self, that libido onto an ego ideal imposed from without, would be the distinction between the subject's relationship to an image of themselves, an idealized image, and how that idealized image starts to take on certain values in terms of how it is seen and located in the eyes or from the perspective of a loving or authoritative other, a parental figure. And that aspect, displacement of libido onto an ego ideal imposed from without, is what would be in the secondary part of narcissism for Lacan. And the image itself and what it contains and its idealizing, narcissistic, substantializing qualities are part of what he would consider to be a first part of narcissism. Just one other brief quote that Lee mentions on the following page. He's linking this a lot more to of course, to the aggressivity paper and the important concept of transitivism. And he's talking about how Lacan mentions there, and here's a quote from Lacan, during the whole of this period, okay, this is the initial image assuming role of the development of the child. During the whole of this period, one will record the emotional reactions and articulated evidences of normal transitivism. So normal transitivism, we know one child is hit and claims the child next to that child feels like they've been hit, for example, or one child hits another child and then they'll say, well, I've been hit. There's kind of an overexpansion of what the ego considers to include itself. These transitive behaviors, this is Lee's commentary, stem from the fact that the narcissistic identification with the visual image that constitutes the young ego is inherently alienating. Not only is the mirror reflection other than the child, but once the child begins the games of identifying with visual images, countless images of others offer themselves for identification. So that kind of makes it sound like a bit of a sequence, and it's probably more complicated than merely a sequence, but mirror reflection games as linked to the games of identifying not merely with visual images, but countless images of others. So again, we're trying to create that distinction between the function of an ego, the function of an image to create a kind of bodily cohesion, a kind of resolution of physical corporeal experience in one's location in the world, and how that's a kind of stepping stone to a mode of egoic self-understanding, which implies an ego ideal, a symbolic location. So those two distinctions, on the one hand, an earlier type of narcissism, and a following type of narcissism, which correlate, I think, to notions of ideal ego, which is fundamentally imaginary, and ego ideal, which is fundamentally symbolic in nature, or Lacan's way of responding to Freud's ideas of primary and secondary narcissism. There'll probably be more to say on that topic, but let's stop there.